All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Rob and Nikki and everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Is that all good? Yeah. All right. Great. Yes, as Rob said, I've been thinking quite a lot for the last while about kind of mescaline art and all the different things that we might mean by that. And of course, this is part of the wider question about psychedelic art and what we might mean by psychedelic art and how psychedelic as a as an aesthetic, as a visual style relates to the actual psychedelic experience. And as usual, I think mescaline is a very good way of thinking about this for a couple of specific reasons. The first is that, with its deep roots in indigenous cultures in the America through the cacti, the San Pedro and peyote, mescaline has been used in all kinds of different cultural contexts, around the world and through history. And mescaline art has been lots of very different things in very different times and places. And the other reason is that an awful lot of this unfolded before the term psychedelic was coined, as Nikki said. That was coined as a result of a correspondence between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond in 1956. And since that point, we kind of have psychedelic available to us as a sort of cultural idea. We have a psychedelic culture. We can look at things and say, oh, that's really psychedelic. So it's kind of interesting to take the art of mescaline, because most of that happened before there was this kind of ready-made cultural concept. So we have to think a little bit harder about what we mean and unpack it a bit more, which I think is really interesting. So just to give an example of how mescaline and psychedelic interplay, I'll start with the cover of this book, which started with, I was asked to provide a design brief for this, and I said, well, obviously I want it to be, psychedelic as fuck, but also not in the kind of way that that sort of designers now think of as psychedelic. So not kind of like op art and fractals and CGI, not that modern visual psychedelic language. I'd like to sort of evoke an older language from the heyday of mescaline research, which was really the 1920s to the 1950s. So looking at abstract art from that period, particularly because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of descriptions, trip reports of mescaline from that time. And the predominant thing is people lying often in a darkened room with their closed eyelids, describing in enormous detail these geometrical patterns that they're seeing. So I want something that's psychedelic but coming out of darkness, the kind of thing you'd see on your kind of closed eyes, something more hypnagogic rather than the kind of bright, jangly psychedelic language that we have today. So this is my main cultural reference for them, if I can find which is the forward. There you go. Do it myself now. Yeah, so this was my main visual reference that I supplied, was the work of Oskar Fischinger. And Fischinger was a German abstract artist in the 1920s whose stuff is really awesome and kind of, really sort of jibes with the sort of, the sort of mescaline reportage of that era. And he was also an animator. He did some early film animation, which is really beautiful. That stuff with those really early German color systems in the 20s that looked like kind of stained glass windows. And then in the 1930s, Fischinger went to Hollywood and did the work that is like by far his best known work today. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Which was, he was hired by Walt Disney to do the opening sequence for Fantasia. And this was one of the first feature-length animated films. Previous ones had just been kind of fairy tales, Snow White and Pinocchio. And this time Disney wanted to do something much more ambitious that was kind of, about musicals, which was kind of illustrations to music, with an orchestra. So it was kind of introducing that Disney audience to something that they weren't very familiar with. So they decided to do this initial opening sequence, and it starts with a silhouette of the conductor and then kind of silhouettes of different parts of the orchestra, introducing them as they're kind of tuning up with a voiceover explaining them. And then when the orchestra starts up, it just goes into this incredible Fischinger animation, which is just pure synesthesia, just light and color and sound. So this is like, you start off with the strings of the cello, and then they turn into kind of, sort of abstract strings that are vibrating, and then they turn into kind of huge waves of color that ripple across the screen. It's on YouTube anyway, you can look it up. It's fantastic. And I saw it at a very early and impressionable age, and I think it was probably my first psychedelic experience, either that or Noz at the dentist. And so that was kind of one of the things that always sort of imprinted it for me. But then I wasn't the only one, in fact, because Fantasia got a re-release in 1969 and 1970 in the States, where it was packaged up quite differently. Previously, it had been like a family sort of kids film and not very successful. And they did a kind of psychedelic ad campaign, and they ran it at college campuses and midnight movie screenings, and it was incredibly successful. And Disney had to put out a little newsletter to all the sort of cinema managers saying there might be some strange people coming to see this Disney film, and they might be rather oddly dressed, and they might not have shoes, and they might prefer to lie in the aisle rather than sitting in the seats, but just don't worry about it, it's fine. And so it then became kind of psychedelic. And in fact, in the first edition of the Psychedelics Encyclopedia by Peter Stafford, which came out in 1973 and was one of the very first psychedelic reference books, there's a good little section on mescaline, and it talks about the experiments that German scientists like Kurt Behringer were running in the 1920s. And then it says, and one of the subjects of Behringer's mescaline experiments was Oskar Fischinger, and then that was this opening sequence of Fantasia was his attempt to put this incredible flux and succession of psychedelic images that he'd seen on mescaline onto the screen. So I spent years looking around for any reference to this before 1973, and I've not been able to find one. And in fact, somebody around that time got interested. Fischinger was no longer around, but his daughter was, and she was interviewed, and she said, no, my dad definitely was not injected with mescaline at Heidelberg Psychiatric Clinic. I think I would have known about that. So I guess people sort of saw Fantasia through psychedelic eyes, and they went, wow, this is really trippy, but it was from the 20s, so what drugs were around? Well, there's lots of mescaline experiments in Germany. Well, Fischinger, so it's kind of become psychedelic art. So, if you look at this stuff, it's, is it mescaline art? Probably not. Is it psychedelic? For me, it definitely is, and not just for me. I think you could argue that this was a kind of formative influence on the emerging idea of, the psychedelic aesthetic at that time. So I backtrack to the very beginning, as close as I can find. I reckon this is the beginning. This is the first piece of mescaline art in the sense that, very literal, direct sense. It's a representation of a cactus that contains mescaline, so it's right there on the image. This is carved in the temple site of Chavín, up in the kind of high Andes in Peru. It's about 3,000 years old, and you can see that this is a figure, a humanoid figure, with jaguar fangs and claws and snakes for hair, clutching a San Pedro cactus. So does that mean that all the rest of the art at Chavín is mescaline art? Well, it's certainly really, really trippy. This is the kind of stuff you find at Chavín. Behind the temple is a kind of big plaza, and at the back of the big plaza is a pyramid full of sunken chambers with these amazing carved figures like this one. You can see that's So it's got a skylight, letting in some light. This is a tiny chamber with this image, and there are lots of these figures, usually kind of jaguar fanged, and they kind of wrap around stones, and they are kind of multi-dimensional in the sense that if you unwrap them, you can see that there are kind of smaller images kind of buried within the bigger ones. So, and then, when you look at them, kind of this one on the right is called the Raimundi Stela. This is a kind of very famous one, sort of stone pillar about this high. And you've again got these, jaguar fanged and clawed beings. But here, kind of, as they often are, kind of multiplied on top of each other, with all these stacked vertical repetitions, So is this mescaline art? Well, I don't know about you, but to me, this just screams DMT. It just looks so like, contemporary sort of representations of DMT art, the way that, all these geometries are stretched and multiplied. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence for the presence of DMT at Chavín. There are lots of Chavín era sites. You find those snuff trays and snuffing tubes, bone snuffing tubes that were used for snuffing powdered anadenanthera seeds, vilca. So that's mostly 5-MeO, DMT. And that's very, very present in the culture. And on the walls of Chavín, on the outside of the temple, there are loads of kind of large sculpted heads, mostly sort of in a state of transformation between humans and jaguars, sprouting fangs and things, and quite a few of them have huge, great gouts of snot coming out of their noses. So there's quite a lot of direct evidence for the presence of DMT. So this is, in a way, the opposite problem from the problem that we have with trying to insert psychedelics into, European, ancient and classical sites where we're mostly reading a line of poetry this way or that way. There's a lot of direct evidence for psychedelics here, and I think, although you can't tell the way in which they were used, I think the architecture of the site suggests that it was probably sort of the use of San Pedro and anadenanthera DMT in combination. So that gives us a very interesting early charter for the particularly excellent attributes of the phenethylamine and tryptamine combination. But in my experience in that combination, what really happens is that the San Pedro enhances the DMT and makes the experience last longer. So I would say, even though there's, direct pictorial evidence of San Pedro at the site, I wouldn't call this mescaline art. This, to me, looks like something that's more connected with DMT. Although, as I'll show in a minute, what things look like to our modern psychedelic eyes is not always, a reliable guide. So here's something that we would probably think of straight away as, I won't say mescaline art, I'll say peyote art, because it's a bit reductive to kind of keep saying mescaline when you're talking about contexts in which they, of the sacred use of the cacti. So this is probably what we most associate with peyote art. This is art of from the Huichol people in the northern deserts of Mexico, where the peyote grows originally. And, ever since I first saw this, I thought, wow, that's really kind of like peyote art or even mescaline art. There's something about the color spectrum, how sort of solar it is and how radiant, and the use of, these complementary colors, green and reds, that set up these sort of jangly kind of op-arty, oppositions. And this is one, this is about 20 years old. You can see it's a really good one for seeing the peyote. This is by an artist called Alejandro Lopez Torres, and the peyote here depicting the 5 pillars which hold up the sky. This one on the right, much more recent. In fact, this is currently on show in London at the October Gallery. There's an exhibition of Huichol and Native American art there with loads of amazing stuff. And it's free, and it's until February. Until I started digging into it, I hadn't really thought about what Huichol art used to look like Because obviously, as soon as you stop to think about it, you know, these are yarn paintings made with threads, which are sort of synthetic threads and aniline synthetic dyes. And it turns out that what Huichol art used to look like was this. This was the first anthropologist to collect Huichol art in the 1930s, called Robert Zing. This is sort of stuff from his collection. And at that time, it was quite different. There wasn't any art produced for sale. All of this work was what's called votive art. So it was done for the temples and for the temple ceremonies. And all the dyes were natural dyes. And, you know, mostly these were things that were left in temples or left out at sacred sites in the desert. And there aren't really many yarn paintings at all. This one on the bottom right is about the first yarn painting. And they seem to have evolved originally as kind of portable versions of these stone discs. That was what people used to make at the time. And it was only really in the 60s and 70s that yarn painting started becoming a form, you know, when these new sort of coloured threads came in, and that Huichol people started producing works of art for sale. So what's changed between here and here is, well, almost everything, because in another way, maybe nothing at all. But this whole form, you know, of the yarn painting, they're always mounted on plywood at the back. That was apparently the idea of a folk art collector and trader in Zacatecas, who said, you know, why don't you mount them on plywood? They'll be really light and easy to transport. The very first yarn paintings, when you see them, just have, you know, like one single little motif, like this one. Or then you start to get ones in the 50s and 60s which have one thing like a deer. And this kind of real crowded canvas is still emerging. I mean, you still didn't see much of that 20 years ago. But that kind of apparently started with Peter Furst, the anthropologist, who went out in the 60s to write about the peyote hunt, and who said, you know, who sat down with one of the Marikamis and shamans and said, you know, tell me these stories from your mythology, and he got him to kind of draw, you know, all the figures and tell the stories. So that kind of emerged from an interaction, you know, between sort of traditional Huichol practices and the sort of evolving understanding of the outside world. You know, and at this point, Huichol art is kind of, you know, the most obvious representation of their culture. You know, it's been their real lifeline in terms of economic survival, and it's kind of incredibly distinctively theirs. You know, even though it's kind of emerged, you know, in dialogue with the sort of Western art markets. You know, you just look at this and straight away you recognize it as Huichol. It's been incredibly effective for them in projecting their vision out to the wider world and in keeping their traditional lifestyles going. So so I think, you know, you have to, you know, then it kind of, I realized that, in fact, when I'd looked at this stuff originally and gone, wow, that's just incredibly psychedelic. You know, part of what I was seeing was our modern idea of what is psychedelic being reflected back at me and recognizing it. You know, it's kind of in dialogue. So, I mean, this work is just as much about the peyote as the modern stuff. You know, you might, if you're a purist, say even more so, because this is votive work and it's done for sacred and ceremonial purposes, as opposed to being done commercially for sale. I think the Huichol probably wouldn't recognize that as such an important distinction. But, you know, it does kind of clue us up to the fact that a lot of what is actually mescaline art or kind of work done, you know, on psychedelic plants doesn't signal itself to us particularly. You know, you wouldn't pick that out as being particularly psychedelic. And on the other hand, there are also loads and loads of images and artworks from other cultures that are not psychedelic cultures that are spectacularly psychedelic. I've had fun always have fun looking around for examples of this. This is my current favorite, which could hardly be more psychedelic, but that is actually the ceiling of a mosque in Iran. And it's not even like a medieval mosque where we might go, oh, well, maybe there was like sort of Sufis and sort of hashish and cannabis involved. This is like a 19th century mosque in Shiite Iran. It's probably hard to think of a less psychedelic culture on the planet, but it's also hard to kind of imagine an image that's more psychedelic than that. So here's another different approach to peyote art, which is from the Native American church. You don't see this anywhere near as much as you see the Huichol art, because whereas the Huichol, are very invested in kind of getting their vision out to the world, the Native American church are really producing work, for themselves and for their own members. So there isn't very much kind of gallery art like this. This is by a Kiowa artist called James Okia. In the 70s, there was a bit of a kind of school of kind of Kiowa artists who did a lot of really beautiful stuff like this. And the original of this is in a museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But there's not a lot of museum pieces. There isn't really Native American church art that's kind of what you call authentic or indigenous, because it's a kind of syncretic and sort of modern movement. Most of what you see is kind of well, you see it a bit here. It's kind of collections of emblems and motifs, almost heraldic. And it's the kind of art that we would associate more with sort of tattoo art today. And often it used to be sort of engraved on silverwork and things. But these days, particularly with the Navajo, who are the most dynamic and most creative artists in the Native American church at the moment. The paintings that they paint on, things like the sort of water buckets that they use in the ceremonies, are these kind of clusters of symbols and expressions of the peyote meeting that look a bit like, it's more like the kind of thing you'd expect to see painted on the fuel tank of a Harley Davidson, or a T-shirt or something. It's that kind of graphic art. And you can see that here, symbols like the peyote bird, which is a big thing in Plains Native American peyote, right? The peyote bird carries smoke and prayers up to heaven, through the hole in the teepee. You can see it up there. You've got the drum and the rattle and the accessories, and above it, the moon and the deer, the kind of big symbols or metaphors that preside over what's going on. But there are a couple of things here that I think are kind of make it specifically sort of peyote art. One is it's very rare in Native American art for there to be any attempt to, visualize, the sort of visual aspects of the peyote experience. But I think you get a bit of this here with the way that the eagle feather fan is fanned out and the way it follows from the roadman's hands. That kind of looks to me, or really suggests to me, that kind of sort of doubling of images, that sort of, tracer movements. But it's very subtly done. It's very much within the sort of emblematic kind of field of what's going on. And the other thing, of course, is the peyote itself, which you have to look quite hard to see. But when you do spot it, it is, of course, where it always is, absolutely central, right on the altar there, right in the middle of the ceremony. And that, I think, is also very expressive of the way that peyote sits within the Native American church. They see very clearly the sort of white man's instinct to look at their culture and reach in and just pick out the psychedelic bit, because that's the bit that we find cool and interesting. And, the whole culture is built around the fact that it's not like a psychedelic that's sort of stuck in the middle of our culture. This is our culture, and the experience that we have during the meeting is not just about the peyote. It's certainly not just about the mescaline in the peyote. It's about the collective. It's about the ritual. It's about the whole experience. So I really like the way that, the peyote sits here kind of absolutely central, but also not advertising itself. It's like they say, the peyote is the smallest plant in the desert, and you have to make yourself as small as the peyote and as humble, if it's going to talk to you, if it's going to teach you anything. So this was also the culture out of which peyote and then mescaline reached the modern West in the 1890s. doctors and anthropologists out in Oklahoma and in the American Southwest became aware of the peyote ceremony for the first time and brought peyote back. And the first clinical experiments with it, the beginning of psychedelic science, if you like, happened in kind of 1895, 1896 in Washington, D.C., and then around the place, William James, who Peter was talking about, was among the sort of famous scientists who experimented with it early on. And that also brought it to Britain. The very first psychedelic experiences in Britain took place in London in 1897, and this was Havelock Ellis and his friends, who were sort of decadent aesthetes of that period, poets like W.B. Yeats and so on. And that's really fascinating, I think, because it gives us a psychedelic eye on this period in Western art. So Havelock Ellis writes a very, very long description of his peyote trip, and it's very much focused on the visuals, on the descriptions of what he saw, kind of with closed eyes, and then when he turned up his gas lamp. And he's trying to describe, the peyote vision to his contemporaries in terms of the art that they're familiar with. So we get to see, what somebody looking, with psychedelic eyes makes of that period. And Ellis talks about a lot of art in different cultures around the world. He said, sometimes this looked to me like those kind of filigreed lattice kind of carved wood panels that you get in Morocco and Cairo. And sometimes he references things like Maori carvings, on tattoos or body art. But in terms of Western art, he says, the Western artist at the moment who really captures this experience is Claude Monet. And because Monet does what Ellis says one of the really striking things about vision on peyote is that you look at something and there's like a little moment before your brain clicks in and goes, oh yeah, that's a table or that's a lamp, and then you realize that there is this period that we never normally concentrate on when you see something, and first of all, what you see is color and shape and form and light and shade and darkness, and then the brain clicks in and makes it something familiar, So this is what Monet and the Impressionists were doing, is trying to unpick that, trying to capture what our eye actually sees before our brain kicks in. So it's very interesting to see that movement in art, from a psychedelic perspective. The other thing that everybody reaches for in these early psychedelic sort of peyote experiments in the 1890s to describe what they're seeing is electricity. This is the beginning of the electric age. This is the very first time when people are seeing, electric light displays and things. And from the very first experiments, when people say, well, I closed my eyes and I saw these amazing sort of like bright sort of dazzling filaments of color, and they looked like electric light, and this, I think it's interesting. This also connects in a way to sort of indigenous ideas of the experience. If you look at like the Aztec flower poems, where they kind of describe, where these plants come from, they say, this comes from the domain of the sun. And this is, a higher realm where everything is stepped up to a higher energetic level. And instead of seeing matter, physical object, we just see light. Instead of being sort of trapped in a moment of time, we're in eternity. And, this is, and what's associated with that in sort of Aztec and traditional indigenous Mexican cultures is things like gemstones, the most dazzlingly sort of beautiful things in nature, and mother of pearl, and particularly the wings of tropical birds, quetzals and macaws, and I think my experience of mescaline is that, those kind of iridescent things just really sort of pop. And there's a great description by Arthur Symons, who is one of the people who Havelock Ellis gave peyote to, and at the end of his trip, in the middle of the night, they were in an apartment in the temple. He walked down to the embankment and looks across at the south bank, and there is one of the very first electric signs in London, huge, great, flashing red electric letters just saying Bovril. And our to things like this at one remove, because we have the chance to see what in a particular culture strikes people on psychedelics. So after this, particularly after mescaline was first synthesized in the laboratory 100 years ago in 1919, you start to get a lot of experimental work, psychologists and psychiatrists, particularly in Germany, giving mescaline to enormous numbers of people and mostly getting them to describe their visions. This is the bit of the mescaline experience that kind of really interests Western culture from the beginning, is this visual aspect. And scientists are particularly interested in the fact that you can inject somebody with mescaline and then kind of lie them down on a bed and get them to close their eyes, and then they will just talk to you and explain what they're seeing, you know, this kind of these ever-changing sort of flux of visions. So you have immensely long trip reports from this period, you know, dozens and dozens of them. Kurt Beringer, who did the main experiment, his book's 100 pages long. His appendix of the trip reports is like way over 200 pages long. And they're very interested in mescaline visions initially, to see what they can tell you about the psychology of the subject. So, are there different personality types? Do different types of people see different things? Can you tell something about somebody from, their response to mescaline? And by and large, they conclude that you can't. That these, you get this endless sort of parade and procession of visions that doesn't seem to come from anywhere, don't seem to connect to anything particular in the unconscious of the subject. They seem sort of more mechanical. And the person who makes most sense of all these visions is a psychologist called Heinrich Kluwer, who takes mescaline himself and who also reads through all these hundreds and hundreds of pages of reportage and notices that if you kind of get behind what people are describing, there are certain basic geometric patterns there, which he calls form constants, like this, like the lattice, or the tunnel, or the cobweb, or the spiral, and he kind of enumerates these things, and he starts to speculate that this must tell us something about the physiology of the eye and the brain and what mescaline is doing, that the larger dose you take, the more dominant, these kind of interference patterns are, and the more, colors seem to become more dazzling, contrast seems to become brighter, so he describes in some detail what mescaline is actually doing to vision. And this has been quite a productive field. There are still, cognitive scientists working on all this. You might be familiar with it from David Lewis Williams, whose theory about Paleolithic cave art is based on comparing Kluwer's form constants with cave art and, sort of arguing on that basis that they must have been done in altered states of consciousness. But what's interesting, I think, is that Kluwer was quite skeptical about this work. He said, yeah, okay, there's something going on. This is going to tell us something about kind of how the eye and the brain process information and how mescaline interrupts that process. But if you've actually taken it yourself, then you know that, this is only kind of the surface of it. It's not like just peering through a kaleidoscope and seeing pretty pictures. This is really profound stuff. It's really meaningful. You're really immersed in it. And you're not, you're never going to get, to that sense of it just by analyzing it structurally in these terms. So from the 1930s onwards, you get quite a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists giving mescaline to people like writers and philosophers, who can give some sense of what they, some meaning to the experience. So you get people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Walter Benjamin, and particularly artists. There's like a whole, very sort of fertile interaction here between artists and scientists, which is basically about psychologists and psychiatrists getting artists into laboratories and giving them mescaline and getting them to paint or draw. This is probably the first work of art by a Western artist painted on a major psychedelic. This is Stanislav Witkiewicz, who was a Polish avant-gardist. This is from 1929. Witkiewicz did lots of paintings on different drugs, and he always regarded the drug that he'd done it with as a collaborator, so they're always in the signature. You can see here at the bottom, Mescaline from Merck was his sort of collaborator on this one. And this is kind of, this is something that Rob kind of raised and sort of with Nikki. You know, this kind of crosses a line. This is a different kind of mescaline art. This is work actually produced while on mescaline. And I doubt very much whether this had ever been done before in indigenous cultures. Then the experience and the making of the art about it are separate things. So what happens when you actually try and capture the experience while you're on it? Well, I think Witkiewicz was really amazing at this because he, and I think partly because in his day job, he was a society portrait painter and really, really prolific. He'd paint, you know, sometimes 5 or 6 portraits in a day, so he could work really, really fast, and he had really good line. And I think you can see that he's still like tripping really hard at the point he's painting this. You know, not just all the kind of line forces of lines and the way that the perspective is kind of popping in and out, but also, yeah, that kind of iridescence, the sort of pink and stuff. You know, I think this, you know, this is, you know, amazingly successful actually at capturing that, given the difficulties that you have when painting on mescaline, which are all, you know, pretty basic ones like hand-eye coordination and concentration, you know, which are, you know, it's actually a really difficult state to be painting in, just as it's a difficult state to be writing in. This is from a couple of a series of experiments that were done here in London at the Maudsley Hospital. A couple of psychiatrists decided to give mescaline to a group of surrealist artists to see what they'd produce. They were studying hallucinations, and you know, they wanted to be able to kind of externalize them and see what these artists were seeing. And they picked surrealists because they thought, well, they're used to automatic drawing and kind of all these sort of unconscious productions. There's, you know, a big range of this stuff, which is very interesting. Some of it, to our modern eyes, looks very psychedelic, like the one on the left. Others, not so much. This one on the right by Basil Beaumont, I think you'd just look at that out of context and go, it's cubist or something. You might be familiar with this one from the cover of the Cypress edition that we've got out there, in which Basil Beaumont's experience report of what it was like to produce this work for a couple of psychiatrists in the Maudsley Hospital is reproduced for the first time. So thanks to Nikki and to Rob for getting it out there. I think it's a really amazing trip report. Basil Beaumont had like a nightmarish experience. Other people had really good experiences. The other report from the Maudsley is from a surrealist artist called Julian Trevelyan, and he said, it was just amazing. As soon as the mescaline kicked in, I just couldn't put a line wrong. It was like I wasn't painting on paper anymore. It was like 3D, and everything I did was just kind of perfect and great, you know. And you know, he found it really enjoyable, and you know, took mescaline again. But the funny thing is that Trevelyan's work that he did on mescaline looks really quite similar to the work that he did not on mescaline. Basil Beaumont, who had a much more difficult experience, there's at least 3 works by him from that, and they're all quite different. You wouldn't recognize them all as the same artist. And I think basically every artist kind of painting in this kind of clinical situation, trying, you know, this is kind of mescaline art at its most kind of literal in a way, you know, trying to reproduce this. I think every artist basically at some point, once the drug starts to take hold, has to make a choice. You know, do I stay with my tried and tested, you know, techniques, or do I just forget all that and go with the flow? You know, and you can see lots of people responding in different ways. And there are some artists found it really positive and enjoyable, like Trevelyan, and you know, and others felt, you know, it was really liberating. It took them out of their comfort zone. They could do whatever they wanted. You know, they weren't working for the market in the way that they normally were. But there are quite a lot of other artists found it very unsatisfying, you know, doing this kind of scientific work, because, you know, you're being asked to produce a kind of specimen work. You know, this is what a mescaline hallucination looks like, you know, reproduced as a figure in a scientific paper. And when you do that, you know, where's the artist? Where's the intention? You know, if you're that reductive about it, you know, then the artist is no longer in the work. And a lot of artists found that kind of dry and frustrating. So this is kind of the beginning of the period where mescaline starts to be used a lot in psychiatry, particularly in the 50s. And of course, this is how Aldous Huxley gets hold of it. The psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond supplies him with some mescaline for his first trip, which he writes up in 1954 as The Doors of Perception. And it's after that that Huxley and Osmond have this correspondence where they're looking for a new word to describe, well, currently at that point, mescaline and LSD, because psilocybin and DMT hadn't yet been synthesized at that point, and they come up with the word psychedelic. You know, so in that sense, Huxley's mescaline trip is the first psychedelic experience, and this is the first psychedelic book jacket. This is the first edition, the British first edition, designed by an artist called John Woodcock. And it's very interesting to see sort of, you know, the psychedelic style starting to emerge. That one of the main motifs here, the eye, you know, is probably the single most predominant, you know, motif in the psychedelic art of the 60s and the next generation to come, along actually with Kluver's form constants, you know, spirals and tunnels and worlds and all those kind of shapes. You know, all that language was kind of there to be drawn on. And I think Woodcock has kind of quite literally taken the title, you know, perception, you know, and sort of produced something based around the eye. But I think he's also really caught what was so successful about Doors of Perception, which was this fusion of science and mysticism. You know, because we forget now, this was quite late in Huxley's career. It was a long time since he had a big, successful book. And a lot of kind of critics and a lot of his audience were kind of getting a bit bored with all this stuff about the Vedanta and the perennial philosophy and all this mystical stuff. And, you know, a lot of reviews of his books went, you know, this is all a bit dry and cranky and dull. But then kind of as soon as he, you know, did his mescaline experience, it suddenly gave it this real kind of cutting-edge, sciencey feeling, you know, because mescaline was kind of being written about, you know, quite widely as, you know, something that might unlock the key to schizophrenia. So it was this kind of fusion of science with mystical ideas. You know, a lot of the Doors of Perception, a lot of the famous ideas in that, like, you know, the consciousness being a reducing valve. Huxley had written all that before he ever took mescaline, you know, so it kind of brings a lot of those ideas back within a kind of new sort of cutting edge framework. And I think this catches that very well, and it kind of, you know, we start to get the idea of what psychedelic art is going to look like at this point. So I will finish with three works from 1956, which is the year that the term psychedelic was coined, just to give three little sort of snapshots of what, you know, mescaline art was at that point. So it was becoming, as I said, quite famous. There were sort of articles about mescaline in Time and Newsweek. And so you're starting to get some popular interest and kind of popular sort of representations of it. This is my favorite of those from the period. This is like, the article is somebody describing their mescaline experience, but this is an artist who obviously hasn't taken mescaline themselves. So this is like a very outside idea of what a mescaline trip might look like. You know, again, sort of coming out of this world of 50s magazine design, so without this whole new repertoire of psychedelic imagery to draw on. This, very different, is kind of one of the classics of mescaline art. This is Henri Michaud's work. His first book on mescaline was published in 1956. He carried on to do a long series of books and essays where, with a lot of his drawings that he was drawing kind of while he was on mescaline. And you can't fault Michaud for, stamina. He put himself through it again and again and again, including like one horrible accidental overdose. He kind of kept on taking mescaline because trying to answer the question of what's it really doing? What's the underlying mechanism, beneath this constant flux of imagery, what's actually going on? And he tried to address this in his writing by developing a kind of non-linear style of having multiple texts running at once in the margins of each other, commenting on each other. He had this idea about kind of mescaline being all about what he called chevauchement, kind of, sort of overlappings, and, everything was constantly overlapping, so texts had to overlap. And he was, and there was a kind of sort of trembling movement behind everything. So what he would do in kind of classic old surrealist style was just kind of close his eyes and put his pen on the paper and try and trace that. So you get images like this one on the right, which is almost like a kind of EEG tracing, where he's trying to, get his conscious mind out of the way and see what's really going on. Michaud was, in the end, very unsatisfied with all his work on mescaline. He said it was the enemy of creativity because it was constantly about flux. So every time he tried to fix anything with a word or with a painting or with a line, it was always kind of moving on. It was impossible to do. And he ended up kind of really hating mescaline and saying, because he saw it as a product of science, which he hated as well. And he was like, it's this really crude kind of chemical compound that doesn't really understand human consciousness and just does the same boring mechanical things again and again. But that I always kind of think when I read that if you look at the way that Michaud was working, he would take his mescaline and he'd get his sketch pad and he'd go to bed and he'd kind of close the blinds and try to isolate himself from all external stimuli just to focus on the mescaline action and what it was doing. And I just always think he'd have had a better time if he'd actually gone out and like maybe gone to a park or sort of spent some time in nature or something like that. And he also had no interest in the fact that mescaline occurred in nature. He was never interested in mescaline cacti. He said, I can't be bothered to read anything about these Mexican peasants. I don't think they've got any imagination. I'm not interested in their visions. So I think in a way, Michaud's work is kind of like the last sort of great moment of sort of high modernism, because Michaud had been working in the 20s and 30s in that period and taking drugs. He just hadn't got hold of mescaline at that point. So I think this is kind of, and after Doors of Perception, there's much more interested in this work. But I think he's kind of, in a way, it's kind of the most dedicated phenomenological analysis of what mescaline looks like. But in another way, it's kind of a cul-de-sac. It's very, very dry. He's sort of isolated himself from all other influences, and he's really just kind of looking at himself in the mirror all the time, and it's a far more interesting final image from the same year, which will be much less familiar. This is a British artist called Brian Winter. And Winter was, he was an academic artist. He trained at the Slade by the 1950s. He was starting to get more interested in experimental techniques. He read Doors of Perception and absolutely devoured it. Apparently he could quote huge chunks of it. And then he found somebody who was doing parapsychology experiments with mescaline and looking for volunteers. So he volunteered, had his first mescaline experiment, and then got hold of his own supply and retreated back to his studio, which was in the very far west of Cornwall, up on the high Tor, up above Zena on the north coast, an incredibly remote cottage that Peter and Rob will know what I'm talking about. I think we've all been there in every sense. So he went up there and started producing this work, which he called his new consciousness work. And there are reports of him kind of, having friends over for the weekends and having big mescaline trips, and then he would kind of sit down and work. And he said, the intention of his new consciousness work, he said he was trying to catch that moment that when the eye looks out onto the world that the brain hasn't yet recognized. So this is very much what Havelock Ellis was talking about, what Ellis saw in the Impressionists, but it's also very much what Huxley was talking about. Huxley was saying in Doors of Perception that, you know, he was finally seeing the world as it really was for the very, very first time. And that's what Brian Winter was trying to catch here. And it's interesting that these works are, you know, pretty well known in modern art terms. They're very collectible. David Bowie collected them, among other people. There aren't very many left on the open market now because they've mostly been snapped up. They're quite valuable. I happen to know that this one on the right, Forest Frontier, which I had in an exhibition earlier this year, is insured for £80,000. You know, so they are they're not works that have been forgotten about. They're very highly regarded, but they don't ever seem to have appeared in the psychedelic canon. You know, if you go through, you know, sort of psychedelic art, you know, you can go through dozens and dozens of Pinterest pages and Insta feeds, and I've never ever seen Brian Winter included in that canon. So, is this mescaline art? Yeah, definitely. Is it psychedelic art? Well, I guess at this point that's up to us to decide. Thank you.